but today it should be the moment in which we sit down and discuss, the results of the different groups and share with others our way of discussing certain literatures and topics that are of relevance for the history and philosophy of cosmology in different epochs. So without losing time, I'll leave it to Michel.
Thank you very much. Silvia, thank you for inviting us and to having faith in all the PhD students. Thank you for all the organizers for making this beautiful event. So I'm representing the group 1 who worked on the ancient philosophy. And we studied texts from different civilizations, different cultures, and different epochs, from the Mesoamericans to the Egyptians to the Greeks, of course, and to the, I think that's all. Yes, and to the ancient Hebrews. So I will summarize our points of discussions. Our first point of discussion was the question, the very fundamental question about what is cosmology for the ancient thought. So cosmology, as we saw in the most of the talks, is nowadays seen as a branch of physics dealing with the universe origin, his structure and dynamic, sometimes with the evolution of the universe. And theoretical astrophysicist David Spergel, as you can see on the slide, defines it as a historical science of the universe. However, this notion is this modern definition of cosmology is not really applicable as it is to the ancient thought. The term comes from Latin and it was used in the 17th century in the literature and refers to the study of the cosmos being the ordered universe or the ordered world. Any cosmology is an ensemble of abstract constructions in which a representation of the structure of the order of the universe is given. So the key element here is the order. It is what makes the outside world a cosmos indeed. The Greek term cosmos means the physical world, the sky, but originally in archaic Greek it means the embellishment of something. We find this significance in the term cosmetics. And then by abstraction, the term quickly became synonym of the ordered world. Cosmogony, on the other hand, refers to the genesis of the ordered universe, the study of the origin of the cosmos. And it seemed to us that in the modern use of the term cosmology, we don't really distinguish cosmology from cosmogony, whereas it is the case in some of the ancient texts. For example, the Hazard's Theogony is a cosmogony because it relates the origin of everything in a genealogical model. This text brings our attention to the succession stories and the genealogical tree of the gods that explains the beginning of the universe. But it doesn't contain really other cosmological informations like the structure of the universe or its elements. On the other hand, the Timaeus of Plato, it's both a cosmology and a cosmogony because it speaks about the genesis of the cosmos and its structure. So some cosmologies are cosmogonies, but not all cosmogonies are cosmologies. So a cosmological account in the ancient texts informs us about the ordered structure and the construction of the universe. And we identified some questions that a cosmology asks. These are not exhaustive. Questions like, what is the matter and the primordial elements of the cosmos? How is this matter arranged? What is the map of the heavens? And how can we understand the motions of the heavenly bodies? What is the link between the sky and the rest of the world? And sometimes, how can we cognize the world? We also discussed about different means and different purposes of the ancient cosmologies. They are very diverse. So for the means, we identified the myths, for example, in the Theogony or in Plato's Timaeus. Some parts are qualified as eikos mutos. Some mathematical accounts, for example, in the Babylonians cosmology, we have some astronomical and mathematical models to understand the universe. Then we have speculative philosophy, so the classic Greeks, of course, some religion explanations in the case of the Egyptians, where the cosmology is linked with the gods and the religious system, and finally, mathematical accounts, sorry. It is the case for the Neo-Pythagoreans, for example. For the means for the approaches of the cosmological accounts, we identified some very diverse finalities, like the practical one in the case of the Egyptian cosmology, where the map of the sky and the calendars were based on the flooding of the Nile. So it was made for defining what is the best agriculture calendar to make. We have then political finalities. It is also the case in the Egyptian world, where the cosmological and religious system could be changed for political reasons. So when there were conflicts between dynasties, when a dynasty won, it changed the gods, or some of the gods. Then we have, of course, the speculative finality in the classical Greek cosmologies, and the more one, the Pythagoreans, of which I will be talking later. Another occurring point of discussion was the methodology problem that we encounter when we study ancient cosmologies. What sources do we have to take to study the cosmologies? We do not often have direct texts or sources from the most of the ancient cosmology. So we have to deal with doxography and indirect testimonies, which brings us to the problem of their validity. So in the case of Mesoamerican cosmology, there is evidence that our account of their cosmology was influenced by the late European medieval representations, which give us some false representations, some false models. So we had to look at the artifacts to study them precisely. And I will talk about especially the Pythagorean question. So Pythagoras is a Greek philosopher who lived in the middle of the 6th century in Crotone, and the tradition made Pythagoras a master mathematician, a scientist, but early evidence showed that he was actually known not for his mathematics, but for his theory of the soul, so the immortality of the soul and the reincarnation theory, the theory of transmigration. He was also known for his ritual, for his very strict way of life, which was taught through the acousmata to his disciples. We don't actually know much about him because he wrote nothing, and there are no accounts of his thought from contemporaries. So we find this problem of the sources of the Pythagorean thought, and many of the testimonies that we have of him made him an unhistorical figure, a semi-divine figure from whom the legend says originated all of the Greek philosophy, including Plato's and Aristotle's thought. So this is what we call indeed the Pythagorean question, which is how can we distinguish from the glorification of Pythagoras and from his historical figure? And the solution to this problem is to study the earliest evidence before the distortion of the tradition. However, the first detailed accounts of Pythagoras were written about 150 years after his death. And the most detailed, extended, and influential accounts of his life and thought date to the 3rd century CE, so 800 years after he died, in Diogenes Laertius, Porphyry, and Iamblichus. And all of these works were written at the time where Pythagoras' achievements had become considerably exaggerated. So many scholars turn to Aristotle's and Plato's accounts, even if their style masks sometimes a good amount of reinterpretation of his thought. So I will talk a little bit about Pythagorean cosmology. Here we can see that for the first time, maybe in the Greek world, we had a mathematical account of the world, but this mathematical account of the world, of which we talked very much this week, is actually linked with a precise astronomy in the case of Philolaus and with moral beliefs. So it actually remains controversial if whether Pythagoras engaged in rational cosmology that is typical of the pre-Socratic philosophers, and whether he was a mathematician, but many scholars think that it was Philolaus, who, a century after Pythagoras, who became the first Pythagorean to enter the tradition of pre-Socratic cosmology. Kant, for example, qualifies Pythagorean cosmology as a numerical cosmology. So what does it mean? The Pythagoreans saw the cosmos as structured, according to number. According to Aristotle, he thinks that the things are made by numbers, or that the numbers are causes and principle of things. How is all number for the Pythagoreans? Actually, we are not quite sure, and there are three hypotheses that Aristotle does in metaphysics. Either the number are physical, so they literally are the things, or the things imitate mimestai numbers, or third solution, the elements of the numbers are the elements of the things. So we have basically two alternatives. Either the numbers are immaterial formal principles or physical principles. And if they are indeed immaterial formal principles, this was the case for the Neo-Pythagoreans, then it seems that this cosmological account is very innovative, as it seems the first in the Greek world to find a mathematical principle in the universe. And this would have an enormous tradition later for Plato, for example, and the Platonists. However, the Pythagoreans studied by Aristotle, so the first one, so to say, contrary to Plato, who made the mistake of separating the incorporeals, did not distinguish numbers from the sensible things. So what is this cosmology? Well, the world begins for the Pythagoreans when the numbers are generated, when the two precosmos opposites, so apeiron, unlimited, and peras, join together to constitute the cosmos by producing the number 1, which is a determined number. So when the limit imposes to the unlimited. This imposition is not total, as some apeiron resists in the sensible world, and the limit and unlimited are associated with mathematical values. So the apeiron is odd, and the limit is even, and the one is odd and even. The one is a number, but it has also a cosmological power, and everything, it means numbers, come from the unity, from the one. The sensibles come into being when the one limits the unlimited and the void. So I have here a fragment of Philolaus in the book On the Nature of Things, according to which nature in the cosmos was fitted together harmoniously from the unlimited things, apeira, and also from the limited ones, perai nonta, both in the cosmos and as a whole, and all things within it. Finally, the void exists for the Pythagoreans and Philolaus in particular, and it is incorporated in the universe through a cosmic breathing, pneuma. So this void enters the universe from outside to breathing from the unlimited and separates and differentiates the things that are. The tradition of the Pythagoreans arranged the cosmos according to ratios or proportions that correspond to numbers. The point is 1, the line is 2, the surface or triangle is 3, the pyramid or solid is 4, and some of them arranging the cosmos according to musical consonants, like Philolaus, the octaves and other musical ratios. Pythagoras' cosmos assigns numbers symbolism essential role and treats the tetractus, the first 4 numbers, so 1, 2, 3, and 4, which total to the perfect number 10 and corresponds respectively to the point, to the line, to the plane, and the solid. And this principle, tetractus, has a moral and quasi-religious significance, as you can see in this very famous fragment. Philolaus at least constructed a map of the heavens based on the numbers. If 10 is the perfect number, there must be 10 heavenly bodies, And since fire is the most precious thing, it must be at the place of honors or the heart of the universe. So here you have the fire, the center of the circumference. So there is fire, Hestia, at the heart of the universe. It is also called the guard post of Zeus. And then at the limit of the sky, you have the stars, the heaven of the fixed stars, and then goes from the limit of the skies below the 5 planets, the sun, the moon, the earth, and then a curious thing, the counter-earth, which is an invisible planet that is necessary to get to the number 10 of 10 heavenly bodies. So this astronomical system is not geocentric, which is quite an innovative thing. It is not heliocentric, but it is hestiocentric, central from the fire, Hestia. So this astronomical system is a result of mainly a priori principles. For example, moving the Earth from the center of the universe did not serve to expand astronomical data better, but it was just thought that there was a better thing than the Earth, which must be at the center of the universe. And then we have the case of the counter-Earth. Its existence doesn't result from the observation, but just from symbolical importance of the number 10. So Hoffman, a scholar, said that Philolaus' system is the most impressive example of pre-Socratic speculative astronomy. And I will end by a remark that it is actually anachronistic to think that the Pythagoreans constructed only a speculative mathematical foundation of the universe for theoretical pleasure. It's not true, because Pythagoras' cosmos is actually primarily of a moral and symbolic significance, which is woven into mathematical truth. So I will pass now to Suf. Interrompi condivisione.
Can you stop sharing? Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Just a second. So I will share it. Let me know if you can't see the progression of the PowerPoint, because I couldn't see yours moving at all. So just if you
we
can't
can see
mine,
it.
let me know. Well, but can you see now that it's
Yes.
different? Okay, good. So hi everyone. Sorry I can't be there. I'm not feeling amazing, and I thought I might be cautious. So I'll be shorter. I'll wrap up and I'll say something about the other things that we've touched on. So there were some more general questions that we talked about. One of them is the rational and the mythological aspect of cosmology. So basically, the more ancient or primitive those mythologies, those cosmologies were, the less we tend to find them in a concrete mathematical arrangement. And often we find them in fables or in mythological stories. And we got quite stricken by the concept of the egg. So in many different ancient cosmologies, the concept of an egg, the world is coming out of an egg, came up, as you can see in this picture. And we discussed the idea that it might be related to cosmologies and cosmogonies that tend to be cyclical, so that things start and end and start again. And we mentioned the Hindu mythology, in which they have the gods, and the god Vishnu is the destroyer of the world, and they have the god Brahma, who is the creator. So Vishnu destroys the world and Brahma creates it all over again. And they have a strong concept of an egg in the Hindu mythology. But that brings me to the next issue, which is more related to what I do, which is the idea that cosmologies, and especially cosmogonies, they have to be parallel to religion, because most religion has account of how the world came to be. And if you're a religious person, your cosmological story will have to be compatible with your cosmogony, and therefore also your religious. So we see that in Egypt, we see that in Babylon, And we see that in all of them, those more mythological kind of cosmologies, they serve to kind of bring the cosmology into the community and make it approachable to all members of community. And the service that it does is it kind of gives everyone a unified way of tracking time that is also meaningful. And it tells them something about the world, but it also helps them say worship in the same time, or communicate with the gods at the same time. So it allows religious holidays. And the text that I presented in the reading group is also a semi-religious text. So it's the Book of Enoch, which was created in the 4th to 1st century before Christ. And it's an apocalyptic text. It was written in Aramaic, but it was really important for a lot of the church fathers. It was actually more important to Christianity than Judaism, even though it's related to the old Hebrew Bible. And so in Genesis, it is mentioned that Noah's father, Enoch, walked with God. And this book basically is a description of his walk, not actually with God, but with the angels who came to earth. So after the fall from heaven, the angels saw earth and they saw their beautiful women, and they wanted to come down, and they did, and they taught men all things that they were not supposed to know. So they laid with the human females, the women, but also they taught them how to make war machines, and they taught them how to color their lashes, so how to be vain. And they taught them, most importantly for us, they taught them astronomy, how to read the stars, which is something that apparently needed to be given to humans from the angels, because it was not something that they had. And this book was very important in shaping our concept of heaven and earth geographically, of where we think they are. And it had a lot of influence, say, on like Dante cosmology later on. And so in the book, the angel take Enoch all over the earth. And this is the model that comes up from the book. And we call it gates cosmology, because what happens is, so they take him to the 4 directions, the 4 winds, and each of those directions has something in there that is specific. So in the north, there's where the judgment is, and where hell is for those that are judged, and there's a different hell for humans and for angels. And then in the south, there's the seat of God. And so each direction is special, but also the book explains about the heavenly bodies. So mostly the sun and the moon, and why do they seem to appear every day in a different position, and how do they come into the world when it's very obvious to us or to them that they are not in the world during the night or during the day. And the explanation is that they are kind of stored outside of the world, and outside of the world there's only fire, but they enter the world through gates, and they're being carried on winds. So winds carry the moon or the sun through the gates, and you can see here the gates and here the gates, and those gates are they help to explain the motion of the heavenly bodies. And what those first of all, the gates cosmology is not it's the most explicit in Enoch, but we have some resemblance to it in Aramaic cosmology. So we talked a bit about the transference of knowledge. But even more interesting, the idea of the 12 gate that the book has seem to be maybe derived from a Mesopotamian idea of the zodiacs. And if it is derived from that idea, then the book has been, or the authors of the book have been keeping up with really recent science, which is interesting. So they are basically combining almost biblical mythology with the most cutting edge science of the time, which is the zodiacs, which does help to explain things like heavenly influence and seasons. So we thought that was quite interesting. And then just to wrap up, we found some point both in this text that really and in other texts And one of them that is very explicit in this one is the issue of morality. So if we have a cosmogony, if we think that someone designed the world with a purpose in mind, then our human lives here should follow that purpose. So the biggest questions of a bit banal philosophy of why we're here, there would be an answer, and that would correlate to the cosmology that we follow. And the other issues that I think Michelle already mentioned is the questions of physics and mathematics in cosmology. So in the Book of Enoch, the first book of Enoch, it's divided to 4 books, and the first book give a very physical, geographical account of cosmology. But then a 4th book just gives very thorough mathematical explanations and calculations of the seasons and of how the sun and moon enter through different gates and how does that affect the seasons. And those two seem to be absolutely separate in this book, but also in other accounts, as Michelle said, in the Pythagorean, the physics and mathematical, they seem to be connected, but the accounts are not fully in line. That is, I think Barbara Sattler said something similar about the difference between geometry and arithmetic and how they serve different roles. And it's definitely in Aristotle that physics and mathematics are definitely 2 different branches, even though they sometimes define the same thing. And a very interesting thing that happens in history is that Aristotle's account is taken to be the most reliable description of the physical world, of physical cosmology. But a few hundred years later comes Ptolemy, and he gives a much better mathematical account of the cosmos and of the heavenly motion. And through all the Middle Ages, all the way to Copernicus, those accounts are competing. So those accounts, they do not coincide, so they're not compatible. And the Ptolemaic account, it's better for prediction, but the Aristotelian account is more coherent with the rest of their knowledge. And so the physical mathematical distinction becomes very important. And the last thing we discussed is the epistemic role of cosmology. And what we noticed, and I think is interesting, is that it seems that kind of the peak of pure material cosmology is in ancient Greece, maybe with the pre-Socratics. But as you go more towards the Middle Ages, as you get a more religious society, because cosmology is in clash with religion and cosmogony especially, it must kind of be subordinated to religion. So you're not free anymore in your cosmology. It must be in service of religion. And I will end with a very interesting point about Judaism. So since the 2nd century, there is a prohibition in Judaism to study cosmology. So there's a list, a very short list of things that you're not allowed to teach a big crowd, a big class. So you're not allowed to talk about explicit sexual things with more than 4 people. You're not allowed to do metaphysics with more than 3 people. But there's something that only one student is allowed to learn from you, and he must be a very, very smart student. And even then, if he doesn't get it right, it would have been better for him to never have been born. And then one thing is cosmogony. So it is looking into what is above and beneath, and what was before creation and what will be after it. And the risks of it, which is it's very explicit in the later tradition, is that learning cosmology and cosmogony might teach you things that are not for humans to know. And that takes us back to the beginning of the Book of Enoch, in which angels revealed cosmology and astronomy to humans, but it was not innate human knowledge. And that creates this kind of fear and esoteric tradition around cosmogony. And I will end here.
Thank you. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Yeah, I'm just curious about the last bit. What is there a specific, or is there justification as mentioned as to why there's a prohibition on studying cosmogony and cosmology, or certain restrictions on it? Is it justified in any way?
Yeah, so there are many different interpretations, but most of them have to do with so there are two options, and the first is what you find when you do cosmogony, so might not be in line with what Judaism teaches you. So, you know, in the Bible it says God created the world, but actually, and we're already in the 2nd century here, so we're post Aristotle, and that is something that's very important in the Jewish tradition. So actually, if you do science properly all the way through, let's say, the 15th, 16th centuries, science will teach you that the world is eternal, and so God has not created it. So that is one issue, that you might find heretical views if you do cosmogony. But the most hermeneutic interpretation is that the world is something like the body of God. And so if you look too much into the world, you might find things that are just not fit for human knowledge. So you might come into the secrets of God. And I don't know, there's one story in the Talmud about someone doing that and their mind just burns. So their brain goes on fire and they die because it's too much for them. So that is the second reason.
We will end here.
Okay, I was wondering, because I mean, you touched, it seems to me in the discussion that you had as a group, many topics that are related to both, let's say, the Pythagorean and Platonic tradition, but also others. So given and also you attended the lectures given by, the talks given by other people here in the last few days. And so you're aware of the fact that cosmogony and cosmology are human practices, it's evident, no? So what do you think about, because you didn't mention them, the anthropological aspect that, so does anthropology could explain more, and ethnographic studies can explain more perhaps, or can explain different aspects that are relevant for ancient cosmology or not? If yes, what do you think about it? So maybe you can.
Yes, of course. For example, it's very interesting to study what is the purpose of these questionings of how the world is and how the heavens are structured and moved. As we mentioned, we saw some anthropological purposes, like religious ones, of course, moral ones, also maybe political ones. So we discussed that. However, it was a little bit difficult to discuss because of our background, philosophical background. So it is a thing to think about and to mention, of course. And for example, for the Pythagorean tradition, there is, of course, an anthropological dimension to it, because understanding the cosmos is actually aimed to understand how to behave and how to educate your soul in order to become the most immortal possible and to have the best life. So it was linked. I didn't mention it because I didn't have the time, but for example, all of these astronomical systems and all of these metaphysical principles are actually linked with rituals. sometimes religious rituals in the Pythagorean tradition, like the silence, some dietary restrictions, some even clothing rules, all of that as a way of life, a way of Pythagorean life that accompanies, of course, the purely speculative cosmological constructions. I don't know if Souf has something to say.
So much time for discussion. I was more referring to the fact that we are, let's say, let me say this with a joke, we are monkeys who had an evolution. So in a sense, I was more referring to the fact that there are mathematical practices associated to the construction of cosmological models. And so the way in which we count, for example, not we, but in the past, the way in which they counted and the way in which they organized, for example, agricultural cycles, impact on the way in which we portray the universe. So, and also the way in which we associate or not a role to any god, to is, of course, today, for me, the wish is that cosmology, modern cosmology, contemporary cosmology, frees completely itself from theology. So in a sense, when there is the the result that cosmology cannot give us answers, or physics cannot give us answer, then I wouldn't like to hear like, oh, then we have to rely on theology, but rather think, okay, philosophy gives us some tools in order to see that anthropology, so that human beings, us, so that the answer, let's say, is in our limit in the foundations of mathematics, in other things. It's not that, we cannot write that result because God prevents us from doing that.
In fact, there is the fourth fragment, if I'm right, of Philalaus, who says that everything that is known is number, and that it implies that the epistemological limit, as of course the human knowledge can, or for him maybe, and that we must limit ourselves to understand the cosmos in this way, in this rational way, through also the help of the practices in the Pythagorean tradition. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for holding this presentation. I'll try to be as brief, as concise as possible. In our working group, we have examined writings by various authors. I will turn to the next slide. Between the end of the 16th century and the middle of the 18th century. The materials we have worked with are the following. The first of the texts we have examined, on the infinite universal worlds, is the third of the Italian dialogues that Bruno wrote and published during his stay in England between 1583 and 1585, originally entitled Dell'infinito universo e mondi, in the English translation by Dorothea Wally-Singer, published in 1968, and preceded by a detailed introduction to the life and thought of the philosopher. In the case of Christian Wolff, we have focused on some relevant passages of two of his most important works, his German Metaphysics and his Cosmologia Generalis. To the same, we have also drawn on the paper by Matteo Favaretti Camposampiero, Infinite Regress, Wolff's Cosmology and the Background of Kant's Antinomies, published in 2021 in Kant Student. The third text we have examined is on the construction of the heavens by the great astronomer and composer William Herschel, born in the Electorate of Hanover in 1738 and emigrated to Great Britain in 1757 at the age of 19. Herschel's conjectures about the total number of stars populating the universe and the formation of nebulae led us to the famous Olbers paradox, formulated by the physicist and astronomer Heinrich Olbers in his paper über die Durchsichtigkeit des Weltraums, which should be translated the transparency of space, no? Published in the Berliner Astronomisches Jahrbuch in 1823. Finally, Professor De Bianchi's remarks on the complementarity and affinity between Kant's theoretical astronomy and Herschel's observational astronomy led us to examine how Klaus Weisbach uses this distinction between theoretical and experimental astronomy to compare the different way in which Kant and contemporary cosmology approach the difficulties in determining the spatio-temporal extension of the universe. We have focused our readings on the different conceptions of the finite and the infinite. This transversal approach has allowed us to explore how the concepts of finite and infinite acquire a diverse meaning in each of those authors, according to more basic ontological, philosophical, and even theological premises. I think that the ascertainment of this fundamental fact reveals the enormous importance of the history of philosophy for a thorough understanding of the evolution of science and astronomy. And it reminds us that, more often than not, what makes a given scientific proposal more or less accepted by the scientific community depends on factors other than the internal consistency of the theory itself. For to be able to astronomically explain a specific area of reality is as important as how human beings perceive these cosmological theories and integrate them into a broader framework, which includes, as has been said, the political, religious, economic, and moral spheres. Now, I will report the results obtained from our discussion of Bruno's work. Since Lorenzo will deal with the other authors, I will try to be as brief and concise as possible, hoping to clarify the most obscure points of my presentation during the question and answers. The first point, in his dialogue on the infinite universe and worlds, Bruno presents his cosmology in opposition to the Aristotelian cosmology exposed in the treatise De Caelo. The nuclear point of the confrontation yields in the Aristotelian conception of infinity. For Aristotle, the finite must be conceived as a complete whole. Accordingly, the finite possesses the characteristic features of substance. It is independent and permanent. The infinite, on the other hand, is that which can always be completed by something else, as for instance, the series of integers, to which we can always add some other number. Yet, no matter how much we can add another number to the series, the result will always be a finite and definite number. Therefore, infinity has no actual existence, but merely a potential one. For Bruno, on the other hand, the finite can only be conceived relationally, that is, in relation to that which limits it. But if the finite depends on that which limits it in order to be and to be conceived, it cannot be conceived independently or substantially. Hence, there can only be a single substance in the universe, the infinite space that contains all bodies and from which all bodies are conceived. Bodies will be nothing but molds or accidents of that single substance. And these for a double reason, because they depend on infinite space in order to be and to be conceived, and because they are always conceived in relation to another body. That brings us to our second point. In Aristotle, finite bodies are particular substances conceived by themselves and independently of each other. Therefore, any relationships established among them are purely accidental and do not modify their nature in any possible way. In Bruno, on the contrary, the bodies that inhabit the universe can only be conceived of in relation to other bodies. As a result, the physical world presents itself as an infinite series of causal relations, according to which one body is conceived in virtue of another body, and so on ad infinitum. It remains an important point to highlight regarding Bruno's conception of the space. According to Aristotle, place is that which surrounds the external surface of a body, just as seawater surrounds the surface of a fish. Hence, place does not belong to the substance of the body, but is accidental to it. A fish can swim in the water and remain the same. The problem, as Bruno points out, is when this body is Aristotle's finite cosmos, whose surface matches the sphere of the fixed stars. Since this surface cannot be enveloped by anything, Aristotle will argue that the surface of the cosmos is concave but not convex. But, according to Bruno, this is like thinking of a coin with just one side. It is thus a purely abstract distinction without any real correlate. For Bruno, instead, the fish cannot be thought of without the sea that contains it. The sea is logically and ontologically prior to the fish. Without the sea, there will be no fish. Space, thus, maintains a relation of genetic causality with the bodies that inhabit it, and without which they could not be or not be conceived. I come to the fourth and last aspect of Bruno's thought that we wanted to highlight in this presentation. Since Aristotelian finite bodies are substances, their permanence constitutes a brute fact. It should not be explained why something remains, but what accounts for its change. Bruno's bodies, on the other hand, having lost all substantiality, are in constant change. Thus, we must not explain why they change, but why they remain. That will lead him to a homeostatic conception of bodies, whereby they compound with each other, maintaining different degrees of stability according to the balance of their parts. The most stable bodies of the universe are the worlds or planetary systems scattered throughout infinite space. These worlds are composed of planets revolving around a central star. Bruno will call waters the planets and suns the stars. The waters feed the suns with the steams they give off, and in turn, the suns heat the waters, nourishing the creatures that inhabit them. Thus, the universe will not have a single center, as in the case of the Aristotelian finite cosmos, but an infinite plurality of centers, as many as the innumerable worlds that populate the universe. To conclude this section, I will briefly point out those features of Bruno's thought that will find continuity in some of the authors we have been discussing this past few days. On the one hand, we have Wolff, who after conceding the possibility of the infinity of the causal series defended by Bruno and, in fact, by Spinoza, will deny it when facing the accusations of atheism hurled against him. Similarly, in his critique of pure reason, Kant will deny that space can be conceived as infinite or finite, but only as indefinite. On the other hand, Bruno's conception of the stars as centers of innumerable planetary formations will reappear in Herschel's depiction of the clusters that form the infinite laboratories or planetary systems populating the universe, each of them organized in a more or less stable way around its center of gravity. But all these will become clearer from what Lorenzo will explain in the following. Thank you.
So I'll be as brief as possible. So as just pointed out by Pablo, Bruno was providing the key ideas and to the discussion. Can you hear me? Yeah, that's better. Discussions that follows. So Christian Wolff, who works at the beginning of the 18th century, provides the link between these previous discussions and Kant and cosmology. So Christian Wolff was committed throughout his life to the principle of sufficient reason. So the idea that everything that exists needs to have a cause. So either it causes itself or it needs an external cause. That's important because we have discussed it. We discussed that in Wolff we find two very different positions. An early philosophy where Wolff endorses infinitism, so the idea that there is an actual infinite number of entities that are related causally, and this infinite series of existing entities are used to prove the existence of God by means of a model proof. So basically the idea is Leibnizian. So if we have an infinite number of contingent entities, we will need a cause of a different order, of a different model nature, which means a necessary being that provides the reason why an infinite series of contingent entities exist. However, this view was harshly criticized by some contemporaries who tended to associate this with the philosophy of Spinoza and therefore to atheism. And so this led Wolff to change his mind. So he was still committed to the principle of sufficient reason, but he started to consider an actual infinite number of entities as impossible, and therefore he turned to finitism, and so he abandoned the modal nature of the proof of God, resorting to a more cosmological-like proof, which leads back at least to the scholastics, to Aquinas. So the idea is we cannot admit anymore an infinite series of existing entities related causally, and because actual infinite is impossible, and the cause must be the first entity in the series. So instead of having an infinite series out of which we have a necessary being that provides the reason why all the contingent entities exist, so the sensible phenomena exist, we will have to resort to the idea that the series is finite and the cause is part of that very series, and precisely at the beginning. So this is important because we have two very different pictures of infinitism and finitism, and this is also historically relevant because it explains the connection between some debates at the end of the 17th century and Kant's philosophy, and we are seeing why. If we read Kant's fourth antinomy, he is contrasting two views. The first one is dogmatism. To the world there belongs something that either is a part of it or is its cause, is an absolutely necessary being. And the other option is labeled empiricism. There is no absolutely, sorry for the typos, I didn't notice that. There's no absolutely necessary being existing anywhere. I think there's some automatic correction because it's too many typos. Existing anywhere, either in the world or outside the world as its cause. So what's interesting here is that Kant never considers the Leibnizian option, that is the idea that there is an actual infinite number of beings, but we do find a necessary cause for that. So this sort of mix between these two theoretical options is not considered, and historical thesis is that this specific form of thinking about the issue was delivered by Wolff himself, who was surrounded by this criticism of Spinozism and atheism, and so this provides a good reason for understanding the present form of the fourth antinomy by Kant. And we also discussed the idea that this could be connected to the first antinomy, so the one concerning the extension of space and time. And then we turn to Wilhelm Herschel, who was a very, very influential scientist, even though he started as a musician. And so we discussed, so one point that we found very important is the connection between cosmology / astrophysics and philosophy. So the first thing that we could notice is that they weren't considered as different subjects, different fields at all. And because we saw that, for example, the German translation of the very influential work by Wilhelm Herschel, presented as an appendix a pre-critical text by Kant about cosmology. So science at the end of the 18th century tended to connect in a very fruitful way some outputs from philosophy and the current cosmological and astrophysical discussion. And another aspect, a very important aspect, was that Herschel was an innovator in terms of technological instruments and tools to carry out observation of the sky, of the heavens. So he was able to construct very complex telescopes, and this, of course, has a great importance. And the theoretical aspect that we discussed is, again, following the dichotomy of infinite and finite number of entities. We focused on the number of stars. And a new entry in this is a Kantian concept. There's the Kantian of indefinite number of stars. So the idea coming from the antinomies of Kant is not that we should not be committed to this impossible choice between, is there a finite number of stars or an infinite number of stars? We should be aware of the limitations of our cognition, which can be changed by the use of technological means. So it's not a fixed limitation, but we cannot have an ultimate answer as to whether there is an infinite number of stars or finite number of stars. And this is connected to Heinrich Olbers, another astronomer, who put forward this interesting riddle. If there's an infinite number of stars, then the sky would be completely bright. But it is not. Therefore, there is no infinite number of stars. That's interesting because it's an a priori argument. And why the first condition of if there's an infinite number of stars, then the sky would be completely bright, as I take it, it means that if you have like the heavens and you have an infinite number of stars, then each point would at some distance present a star, because you have an infinite number of stars. And this means that everything will be surrounded and by light, and everything would be as bright as possible, which means the heavens could never look as they actually look, because we have like bright dots, shiny dots, and darkness. And this was connected to a very important idea in the history of cosmology, that the universe has an history. So the question of the number of stars should also take into account the chronological evolution of the universe. So quite in contrast with an Aristotelian or Greek way of thinking about it, you don't have like this, the heavens and the sky with the fixed stars, but you have a universe as being conceptualized as a process, as something that develops in time. And this comes with all sorts of methodological and epistemological worries, such as we necessarily use instruments that can be subject to perturbations, and since light is a signal that's coming to Earth, this can be disturbed in its travel to us, and so like very important steps in the history of the discipline of cosmology. So two final remarks of things that we discussed over the last days. The first one is connected to this paper by Weisbart, who basically tries to connect in a Herschelian inspiration to connect Kant's discussion of finitism and infinitism and modern cosmology. So the main idea is that, okay, we have to admit that our knowledge is limited, but we can do this in at least two different ways. We have Kant's way, which is a metaphysical reasoning, And then we have physical reasons of the actual universe to think that we cannot know whether the universe is infinite or finite in its extension in space and time, because we have like the horizon, particle horizon is the only way we can get information from the universe, and this is limited, so we cannot know beyond that horizon. But this, according to Weisbart, for modern cosmology is based on physical reasons. By contrast, as we've seen, Kant puts forward an antinomy, the sort of a priori metaphysical reason. The last bit that we discussed that's very interesting is that focusing on the limitations of our knowledge, is it a form of verificationism? So the idea is there actually a precise extension of the universe or a definite number of stars, even though we can never know that number? Or the question is so radical that the limitations of our knowledge lead us to think that reality in itself is indeterminate. So there is no, metaphysically speaking, an actual number of stars, or is it just coming from the fact that we can not know it, but we have to admit that there is such a specific number, determinate number, or maybe not. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thanks, Lorenzo and Pablo. I was just wondering, when you talked about the a priori argument against the fact that there exists an indefinite number of stars. So I was wondering, were there actual replies to this argument also a priori saying that maybe there exists an infinite number of stars, but we cannot observe them all? So like a reply to this argument.
Yeah, I think the opposition is resorting to an argument based on cognitive and epistemological limitations is meant to make the point that it doesn't make sense to raise the question as to whether there is an actual infinite number of stars or not. So I wouldn't connect, because if you assume, like ex hypothesis, you're saying there is an infinite number of stars, and we will never be able to count them all. But this is not the point of focusing on the limitations of our cognitive means, because if we do that, it's precisely not to be committed either to the idea that there is an infinite number of stars, or that there is a finite number of stars. So that's the way we went about it.
Just assume that ma tanto non c'è nessuno a casa, quindi. So we cannot just assume that there's an infinite number of stars and also doubt our cognitive abilities at the same time. That would undermine the initial assumptions. That's what you're saying. Okay, I think I get it.
Is the question as to whether there is an infinite number of stars or a finite number of stars is like a metaphysical question, right? Like regardless of what we can do, we assume that the universe has this fixed nature or structure. But we want precisely, like in a Kantian way, to avoid these ideas and say, a priori, we cannot know because there is an antinomy. It makes sense to endorse both. And so we should evince from this that the best way to solve the issue is to this strange idea of an indefinite number, which can actually change on account of the technological and scientific enhancement of what we can actually know. But of course, I mean, I think this last point I wanted to raise with realism and verificationism. The idea is maybe we will never know the precise number of stars, but we have to assume that, like the proposition, there is an X number of stars is true of one number only, even if we will never be able to know which one. So this would be like a realist way to deal with this. But we thought it's not just because I put forward this example. Like when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he had a precise number of hairs on his head, and we will never be able to know that number. But if we are fully realist, the fact that we cannot retrieve the truth of a proposition doesn't represent a problem if we are realist, right? But does it actually work also in the case of this limit scientific context, like the number of stars in the universe or the infinite extension of the universe? So maybe it's not that easy. It's not just like this thing having many properties we will never know. So that's a problem. And if you're more Kantian, you would say, of course, this is different because it's like the cosmological context that makes it.
Just one more point about this matter. We also talk about how one could retain realism while maintaining that actually there is no definite true value to the matter of how many stars there are in the whole history of the universe. So if you assume some kind of dynamic growing block view of time, or maybe yeah, so you have like a temporal infinite extension of the history of the universe towards the future, and you think past and present things exist and future things do not, then you can actually have like to the question how many stars there will be in the total history of the universe, say the answer is metaphysically determinate, because whichever star will form in the future are still not part of the ontology. And so in that case, you could be able to say, oh, the total number of stars in the universe during its whole history is indefinite. And yet, that has nothing to do with fundamentally with the limits of our knowledge. That's just this point. Other questions? Okay.
Okay. Okay, so let's start. Today we will talk about inflation, inflationary paradigm, and in particular inflation and eternal inflation, and the philosophical issues of both these kind of proposals. Our cosmological problem is the Friedman-Rebed-Robertson-Walker cosmology, and it has some observational issues that, and some of them are solved, let's say, by the inflationary proposals. One problem is called the horizon problem. So it's like 2 points in the sky have this that have never made contact, have the same information, and so we are asking why. So you see the two circles that are not in contact, have never been in contact, but they share the same informations. And so it is as if all the guests at a party, without being able to agree earlier, brought the same dish. So there's something that is missing. And how the inflation solves this problem? Basically, it is the inflation that disconnects this today unrelated part of the sky, because in the past they were in constant contact. And now later we will see how it works. A second observational problem is called the flatness problem. Basically, our universe is almost perfectly homogeneous and isotropic. And we have to answer why is the universe so specially almost flat. And because if you do some calculation, you will see that in order to agree with our observation, our today's observation, we will need very fine-tuned initial conditions. For example, and at the time of a Big Bang nucleosynthesis, this 1 second after the so-called Big Bang, you will need this sort of parameters. So you can't disagree from the unity of the parameter omega more than 10 minus 18 orders of magnitude. And this is a very, very, very fine-tuned prediction. And how the inflation solves also this problem basically is the inflation stretches the universe due to the accelerated expansion. And so this acceleration flattens our local curvature of the space. And it's like this illustrative drawing of how it works. There is another more complicated, formally more complicated problem, and that is the primordial power spectrum of the cold dark matter. So we must have an explanation about the observation regarding the matter distribution of the universe. So basically how the matter is distributed, well, at what scales it is distributed in the universe. So inflation not only predicts a flat and smooth universe, but also provide a mechanism for the production of the primordial density perturbation, which give rise to today's observation. So basically the inflation predicts this part of the primordial spectrum. And the perturbation of the inflaton field, that is a physical field that gives rise to the inflation, that is a phenomenon on accelerated expansion, give us the distribution of the seeds of the galaxies that we observe nowadays. So now we see here there's a peak, and this peak is related to the scales of galaxies. So firstly, galaxy form and how it forms, that it's related on how the inflation works. So how it works, it is a very simple example. So we need a strong accelerated expansion of the universe in order to deal with the flatness and horizon problem. And we need fluctuation of a field to create a density perturbation of the primordial power spectrum. So the proposal is to introduce a mechanism due to the slow rolling, so-called slow rolling of the inflaton field on its potential that it describes is dynamics in some sense. And like a simple analogy is you can think as a ball rolling down on a hill. So the rolling has the effect of accelerating the expansion of the universe. And this is related to some parameters of the model. And finally, this ball, let's say, the swing around the valley, over a valley, and this swinging has its main effect the creation of all the particles of the universe. And this ball is a very special ball that is quantum ball, so it is fluctuating, and this fluctuation gives rise to the overdensity and underdensity of the universe, in which then the cold dark matter can, let's say, fall in and form the structure of the universe. And now we will talk about some philosophical issues of this kind of paradigm, and I left the stage to Ali.
I'll briefly talk about the conceptual problem within the inflationary model, the philosophical issues. There are many philosophical issues related to the inflationary paradigm, but I list here the most important one. First is flexibility in the theory. It is very hard to falsify, which means it is hard to find a phenomenon or a scenario or a model that the theory cannot account for, cannot accommodate. So in this sense, from a Popperian stance on methodology of science, the inflationary paradigm is getting more ad hoc and less fruitful. So this is one of the main worries about the inflationary paradigm. The second issue relates to the initial conditions, because the inflationary paradigm in some sense washes out the dependence of our model or theory or dynamics on the initial conditions of the universe. But the problem is that we don't have access to the sample space. In other words, the initial state of the universe just once happens, and so we do not know whether variations in the initial state would lead to the same final state. In the sense, is one of the weaknesses of the theory. And on the other hand, we do not have access to the dynamics of the theory either. And so it might be that some dynamics would make some of the initial conditions of the universe much more likely than others. In that case, then there would be some dependence of dynamics on the initial condition, contrary to what the infinite paradigm proposes. And so on the other, or for an example, there might be a theory of quantum gravity that puts constraints on the initial state of the universe. And so, for instance, making it symmetric, such that the initial state is more probable. And so this would lead to no uniformity problem. So this is another case in which the dynamics could be dependent on the initial state of the universe. So one of the motivations for proposing the infinite paradigm is to argue that the initial state of the universe has no role to play in the final state, or what we now observe. But a theory of quantum gravity may put constraints on the initial state, and so this independence argument would fail for the inflationary paradigm. That's a brief list of the main issues, and so I'll pass to Yazab.
So that's what happens at the first stage of the creation of the universe following the inflationary models. But what happens later on after the inflation is usually called the eternal inflation. So you have this expansion of the universe at the beginning, but due to inflation, but the universe keeps inflating. So in this sense, eternal inflation is that while inflation eventually ends at a given location, the exponential creation of a new volume allows inflation to continue forever globally in the universe. And particular behavior can be seen perhaps most clearly with the most mathematical control in the situation of eternal inflation driven by false vacuums. In this context, there is always the proposal of multiverse, in which space is broken up into bubbles, as you can see in the picture, or patches whose properties differ from patch to patch, spanning all physical possibilities. So there is also probabilistic interpretation behind it. Well, it's basically this multiverse scenario is a popping of universes, which are bubbles of space moving into tunneling and quantum fluctuations, while the rest of the background of the universe keeps expanding. And the mechanism behind it is the uncertainty principle from quantum mechanics. And this in this model, any outcome is equally possible, since we have this kind of probability interpretation of all possibilities. And so inflation makes no predictions and hence is untestable. And this leads to a set of philosophical issues and conceptual ones that will be discussed now.
Okay, so as Luqaya was saying, there's some very grave philosophical implications of the eternal inflation model. So the existence of the multiverses, so existence of the bubble universes, leads to basically the idea that a multiverse exists. So our universe is only one of many infinitely continuously created new bubbles of new bubble universes that are basically pointing us towards the fact that if anything that can happen will happen, but not to you specifically, but to a duplicative you, because if there exists an infinite number of universes, then there exists an infinite number of duplicates of you and of anything else in the universe. And this leads us to the conclusion that maybe we should revise our idea of how do we calculate or how we think about the frequency of an event, how frequent an event happens. because then we would have to rely, if every event it can infinitely happen in the infinitely number of these bubble universes, then we can say that basically the frequency of an event cannot be calculated by saying, okay, how many events, how many universes contain this event out of the total number of universes, because both are infinite. So we cannot make a fraction to calculate this frequency. So an alternative way to calculate frequency in an eternal inflationary model would be to rely on quantum probability. So this would mean that the frequency of an event happening and repeating itself in the vast number of infinite universes would be dependent on the quantum probability of this event happening. So the probability of an event happening once determines how frequently it will happen across all the bubble, small bubble universes in the multiverse. But this also leads us to a fact that Luqayya has touched upon, which is basically if we have infinite universes, the single event can happen infinite times, then can anything be said to be falsified, basically? So if a theory such as inflationary model predicts that anything that can happen does happen somewhere, sometime, then this very flexible nature of the model tends to be very hard to falsify. So how can we falsify a prediction made by the eternal inflation model? And this is what drove some philosophers to say that the fact that we cannot falsify prediction makes eternal inflation actually not a proper scientific theory, because ever since Karl Popper introduced the notion of falsifiability as a criterion to judge what a scientific theory should be from pseudoscience, then most scientists and philosophers alike think that falsifiability should be at least one of the criteria that a proper scientific theory must have. So treating eternal inflation as a scientific theory, can it lead us to review our notion of falsifiability, or to review or to revise what we understand or how we classify a theory to be scientific or not? So this is a very strong implication that believing in eternal inflation can lead us to revise basically our understanding of science and what it means for a theory to be scientific, as opposed to non-scientific or pseudoscientific or non-scientific. Finally, I just want to talk about another aspect of our implication of believing in eternal inflation and the existence of the multiverse. So a very well-known argument that's been proposed by theologians and religious apologetics, is called the fine-tuning argument, which points out that certain physical variables of the universe have a very fixed range at which life, especially intelligent life, can actually appear and prosper. And they point out towards the fact that this might lead to believing that our universe was finely tuned by a creator or by an intelligent force that chose these values specifically for us to be able to evolve and to observe, basically to be conscious observers of the universe around us. So the existence of a multiverse somehow provides a reply to this argument, and we don't need to believe in finely tuned values anymore, because all of the values exist in the infinite. We have infinite values that can exist, and all of them do at the infinite number of bubble universes that exist in the multiverse and that are continuously appearing by the process of eternal inflation. Of course, the existence of multiverse has also been met by a priori arguments, philosophical arguments from accounts of parsimony, and saying that if you want to posit an infinite number of universes, then this is not as simplistic, because following Occam's razor, we tend to think that if we can explain a phenomenon by positing the least number of existing things, then we should do that. But by positing an infinite number of universes, then that's kind of flies on the is against the principle of Occam's razor. So here comes another issue. Should we use philosophical or metaphysical virtues such as simplicity and parsimony to choose what a scientific theory, to choose what our scientific theory should be, to choose among scientific theories? So how applicable are these virtues to the process of choice of scientific theories? This is, of course, an important and open question that should be discussed by philosophers of physics and the ones who want to explore more the implications of eternal inflationary model. So to conclude, yeah, as you can see, it's a very well prepared, well divided presentation, of course. So my colleagues, comrades, have presented the questions. Basically, they introduced what modern cosmology is concerned about, the problems that we face, the flatness, horizon problems, and the primordial power spectrum. They said that the most popular and successful model currently is the inflationary model. And but they also pointed out to several problems that plague this model. And then Ruqayya talked about eternal inflation, what it involves, what it entails, the existence of multiverses. And then we talked about several philosophical implications of this eternal inflation. Most of them end up in open questions, of course, that need to be properly researched by future researchers. So thank you. Got new questions, so we can go home.
Questions?
So thank you very much for the presentation. So I have, well, two questions. So the first one, we know that in your working group were present Bilenkin, Oridi, and Schmink at some point during this week. So could you briefly mention to us with respect to inflation, how they debated, so which positions were at stake? Not all, I mean, just to briefly report the discussion that probably also influenced a couple of slides here. The other issue is more related to your understanding. It's something that you can do without, I mean, preparation. I would like to know what you felt this morning by listening to the other presentations, and if you can sort of draw very briefly a sketchy comparison between our current cosmology and the problems we encounter in it and past issues, past questions that were typical of cosmology or models.
Okay, so regarding the relationship between maybe this modern cosmology and ancient cosmologies, of course, it's obvious that a different paradigm is used here. The paradigm of physics, as opposed, for example, to myth, that might have been the more dominant paradigm of knowledge in ancient cosmologies. However, I think it is also a very interesting feature that might be in common between both. So that is, so eternal inflation as a model with, as has been said, it predicts everything, cannot be falsified. So this might lead some to think that in some way we've just gone full cycle and we're back to like the myth. Of course, the physicists are going to kill me after that, but I don't care. So if we have a model that's not falsifiable, of course, it's mathematical. We have the equations that lead us to it very well, but not falsifiable, probably will not be able to observe the the existence of other universes anytime soon anyway. So some people might point out that we're back basically to the myths of the ancients, but yeah, I leave that to some other time. So someone wants to answer it.
So for the first question, there was the confrontation of between quantum gravity point of view and inflation, so Chris and Daniele, and then multiverse scenario and inflation. So from the point of view of quantum gravity, how far is this theory true? How insofar it can describe reality, etc., is still open. So from quantum gravity point of view, it's not a decisive answer for to explain the universe around us, because there is always the research, like a whole field working on quantum gravity cosmology that also suggests that there might be no inflation at all, there might be no Big Bang at all, there is a whole bunch of other scenarios that can also deliver explanations to what we see in the universe at some point. And from the point of view of multiverse and genetic inflationary models, the probability that, for example, Alex and Chris discussed mostly is the problem of measure, the problem of the measure in each universe, that it's that is not the measure problem in every universe has a probabilistic measure, and in this sense it cannot describe reality, besides from the fact it's not falsifiable, and it's also kind of science fiction. I'm sorry, but it's the truth.
Why are you apologizing to me? I share.
Yeah, this is what Alex was.
I think Lorenzo.
I just want to add two brief comments on the two questions. The first is that what I can say about the scientific theory from what I've learned from the other works of the other groups is that a scientific theory is a human construction. So, and that's just the case with the inflationary theory. And so, just like the number 10 in Philo's theory, which then forces him to posit a counter, that's the case when also in the inflationary theory we have some supposition, some symbolism, and try to develop the most coherent picture of the world. Of course, we have more evidence, but it doesn't mean that we can go beyond the bounds of reason, our limitations as humans, and so that's the main conclusion from this conference for me, that we are on the same footing with Plato, with Philolaus, and the whole history of evolutionary thinking. We are just we are trying to do our best to come up with a coherent picture of the work. But that's what has been the case throughout the history of science, at least the history of the cosmological thought. And so we are using the same methodological tools, the same, and confronted with the same problems. So that's the first point. And the second point relates to the how the inflation paradigm could be situated in the current physical thought. There are two options. One is that we will come up with a theory of quantum gravity, which rule out the inflation paradigm in the sense that it will constrain the initial conditions of the universe, and so it will tell us that which initial condition or which range of initial conditions could lead to what we currently observe. That's the first option, which would be a refutation in some sense of the inflationary paradigm. But what I have learned from Daniele and the works of his group is that the second option is more probable in the sense that even if we will come up with a successful theory of quantum gravity, it will complement the work of the inflationary paradigm in the sense that it will tell us something about what will happen in the early universe, and then at a certain point of time, maybe the Planck scale or after the Planck scale, then the physics will be dominated by the inflationary phase. So in this sense, the quantum gravity will complement the inflationary paradigm. So that's the answer to I think the first question. So any other questions?
So thank you. We are sort of very naive and simple-minded question. I was wondering, all this talk of possible worlds, how should this be connected to Lewisian-like model realism? So the idea that we have merely logically possible worlds or metaphysically possible worlds, but in this case, I guess it's physically possible worlds. And so I was just wondering if there's a way of connecting this to possible treatment of possible worlds.
Yeah, thanks, Lorenzo. That's a very good question, actually. So it might appear that model realism, Lewisian model realism, which says that there exists an infinite number of possible worlds, metaphysically possible worlds, is similar to the theory of multiverse posited by eternal inflation. But there's a very key difference between the two. The difference is that David Lewis talks about metaphysically possible worlds, while as the multiverse doesn't talk about physically possible worlds, it talks about physically actual worlds. So all of the multiverse bubble universes exist in one world in the Lewisian terms. So it exists in the actual world. So we're not even considering the possible worlds, the parallel worlds that exist. We're only talking about our world. So all of the multiverse exists in our world, which is one of the worlds as defined by Lewis. So one implication of this is that on paper, at least, although I am very much skeptical, we can observe maybe in the future the other universes deposited by the multiverse. However, in Lewisian model realism, there can be no way at all, by definition, any contact or any observation happening between the possible worlds, the parallel worlds. So yeah, thanks for pointing this out, but there's a key difference between the two.
Thank you. So my question is about the term inflation. Does it come primarily from physics, or is it like an application of another concept? So I'm thinking about economic concept, but also biologic one, like inflation of the lungs or something. So is it its use in modern cosmology, is it a proper one, or is it like a metaphor or an analogy of another one? For example, and I don't know if it's true, but many times we use biological analogies to think about the cosmos, like the world is growing, like a living being, it's a living being that dies, or it's breathing, and so on. So does it have anything to do with this concept or not?
I mean, physicists are very famous to give very good names to things and very fantasious name of things. So we use inflation like I think like in other fields like economics. So we need a word to describe some accelerated, faster expansion of the universe. And so, exponentially accelerated expansion of the universe. So, I mean, it is, you can call it not inflation, but exponential accelerated expansion of the universe. So, yeah, I mean, there is a parallel within. I don't know if will come first inflation in cosmology or inflation in economics. Maybe, I don't know, maybe economics.
I guess we should make a distinction between two things. One is the mathematical formalism, because if you ask a physicist what inflation means, he will list for you maybe a model or a mathematical formalism. That's what physicists mean by inflation. And then there is the question of the phenomenology that follows from that model or that mathematical formalism. I guess when we talk about the phenomenology, then yeah, what you're hinting at will be relevant, and different physicists, I guess, maybe use different metaphors to describe the same model or the same mathematical formalism. And depending on their interest, they may use metaphors maybe from economics, from biology, or depending even on their cultural upbringing, may use different other metaphors to describe the same phenomenology. So yeah, but then again, there should be some kind of agreement between different physicists on how to interpret the same model or the same mathematical formalism. So, but I guess this is a relevant point. How physicists talk about the implications, at least at the level of phenomenology of the mathematical models or formalism.
Any more questions? I hope not. Okay, great.